So let me concentrate on today's proceedings. And when I look and entered this room this morning, I saw with much pleasure this big column where you saw actually the whole genealogy of this conference. At the very top, you see Dresden Nexus Conference. And read it right. It is not Dresden Nexus Conference, it is a Dresden Nexus Conference. It is focusing on water, soil, and waste, one of the specialty of UNU-FLORES and one of the specialty of this conference. Then you go one step lower and you see the global challenges: climate change, urbanization, and population growth. I believe this is incidental that we start with climate change. It is useless to debate what is more urgent. All three are interacting, and as the discussion today showed, none of them can be tackled alone, because one makes the other one more difficult and more complex. Then the next step you see towards the SDGs. The member states, the UN community is responding to these challenges, and end of September, the new Sustainable Development Goals will be decided, and 17 goals with 100 plus targets is yet another mega example of nexus, how different aspects of development, of achievements, of human well-being, of environmental sustainability depend on each other. And then you see it is as a nexus approach, and this time the nexus approach is not only the Dresden Nexus, it is also the historically developed water, energy and food security nexus. But if you think in terms of the SDGs, it could be also very much the water and health nexus. It could be also the education and sustainability nexus, and so forth. So and then at the very bottom you see a number of acronyms and logos. These are, many of us come from these organizations. This community is where all this rooted. This community of academia, UN agencies, NGOs, government ministries, and so forth. And if I have any justification to stand here, I just figured out during my professional career, I was associated with 8 of these logos. So this is, thank you, Reza, very much that you put me on the spot. So once I was either member or leader of one of these organizations. So today, day one, we have a distinguished panel. This distinguished panel is composed of the 5 lead conveners of the parallel sessions who will report back and answer a set of questions related to today's topic and to the challenges we are facing. And we have 2 distinguished representatives from member states. One is Dr. Abraha Adugna Ashenafi, the Deputy Bureau Head from the Water Resources Bureau of the National Regional State of Tigray in Ethiopia. And the other one is His Excellency Mohamed Abdelhamid Ibrahim Higazy, Ambassador of the Republic of Egypt to Germany. He was already introduced this morning by Reza Ardakanyan. We shall also have, during this final plenary, a concluding talk, which will be given by Professor Rabbi Mokhtar, whom I will introduce before he starts his comprehensive account of the day. I propose that we proceed in a way that I read out the 3 group of questions we challenge our panelists, mainly those who were leading conveners of the 5, or rather 6, parallel sessions. And after that, the 2 distinguished country representatives will take the floor, comment on it, especially what results they see for their countries or for member states from these proceedings. Then we shall have, hopefully, a dialogue with the audience, and finally, Professor Mokhtar will have the final word in his comprehensive account of the day. The day one in the program, you see the core question: how can adopting a nexus approach may mitigate the growing water, food, and energy insecurity due to climate change from an environmental resource perspective. And this overarching question was specified further, so I'm challenging the 5 lead conveners with the following questions, not to repeat who said what in their session, but to synthesize it around these 3 major topics: climate change, the theme of the day, climate change, which is expected to have significant impact on the various components of the nexus, what kind of conclusions can be drawn in this regard from the presentations of the respective session, and whether are quantitative assessments available and how reliable are they, and which component of the nexus is likely to be the most vulnerable, definitely, to climate change. The second question is, how can we use the nexus or nexi or nexuses? I did not consult a linguist whether it is the plural for nexus is nexuses or nexi or nexi, to provide the basis for adaptation concepts and measures. And the third one is a forward-looking theme. As I already mentioned, the SDGs are around the corner, and from 2015 onwards, they will lead the world to start to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. How far can the Nexus approach contribute to achieve the relevant SDGs? And whether in your session SDGs have been discussed in this light to Nexus or vice versa, and what kind of perspectives have been identified and discussed. So all these starting questions ahead, I would like to invite the first lead conveners, Sergio Zelaya from the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, to give his account. I definitely refrained from telling all your vita. If you think beyond UNCCD something had to be communicated to the audience, please use the first sentence to say who you are or why you are saying what you are going to say, but otherwise the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Bogárdi, and good afternoon to you all, and you will have to bear with me for a couple of minutes. My name is Sergio Zelaya. I come from Honduras, Central America, and I am the special advisor of the Executive Secretary of the Convention to Combat Desertification. Before, I was a coordinator on the global policy, and before that, I was the coordinator for the Latin America unit. Before that, I was working in my government as a Vice Minister of the Environment, but that was in another life. So now, I will try to summarize with my own views. This doesn't hold any of the presenters accountable of what I'm going to say. I'm solely responsible for what I'm going to say. Regarding the question on the what is the expectation of climate change and the nexus, what kind of conclusions were drawn in our first session this morning. It was the first session. We had 5 presenters, very good presenters, and my message that I received from them is that climate change is part of a complexity of issues under the nexus, but this complexity is sometimes portrayed with complex diagrams that need to be translated on the ground, on the local and the ground level, especially in relation to agriculture and with respect to the conflicting interests in the management of the natural resources. So the design of policy and therefore their impacts have to take into account that there is this multi-dimensionality on the issues, and climate change is one of these elements. They mention the drivers of why climate change is also contributing to having an impact on the various components of the nexus. And they mentioned, for example, that there are, in addition to climate change, several other drivers that interact with climate change, like population growth that generates increased demand and also offers opportunities and constraints for the supply. the policies that strengthen business as usual versus innovative policies, the local governance of natural resource management, market conditions, and the food production and water availability. These are some of the driver issues that also interact and influence mutually with climate change. But they also mentioned that increased livelihoods should be at the center of the nexus-oriented policies. But there is a need to be realistic according to ethical boundaries on this policy setting approach. This was in relation of the conclusions of the climate change impacts of the nexus. But we expected more from the session regarding the quantitative assessments available. There were a reference to the idea of a growing perception to act on this multidimensional level, and these quantitative assessments need to be could be a common denominator for the nexus. An increased awareness on the nexus is needed. It's not there yet. Not many of the presenters address the issue of the nexus, but they believe that there will be an increased awareness of the nexus approach after this conference. Modeling was stressed as a priority for policy implementation. Availability of such information and tools need to be made available for the global outreach. As regards the component on the nexus that is more important, reference were made to the interactive mode of the nexus that focus on soil, water, and waste, and as well energy. Due to the conflicting interests that there exist in different scenarios and different conditions and cultures and ecosystems, it is difficult to view what is the most important component of the nexus. Sometimes could be one component, and in another conditions, in another circumstances, other component. And the national objectives should accommodate and welcome and embrace these different type of approaches. So in any case, all these components of the nexus have a strong interconnectedness that must be based on the bottom-up approach. Although few references were made to the word nexus in the session, its principles were mentioned by all the presenters. And one final question addressed is, which nexus are we talking about? The soil, water, and waste, and what about the energy? And energy issues were highlighted as being more stable than other components of the nexus. For example, when we address land and soil and water and agriculture, the issue of climate change has more impacts on agricultural, especially when energy is biomass based. So in general, this was the answer of the group on the first question. What is the climate change adaptation and mitigation regarding to the nexus?
Okay. You want to go through?
The other, perfect. Thank you very much. On the second question, how can we use the nexus to provide the basis for adaptation concepts and measures? The presenters refer to the sustainable land management and integrated water resource management as the policy options for use to adaptation to climate change. Therefore, ecosystem-based adaptation and land-based adaptation are called for. No reference were made on the 2 degrees centigrade target and how adaptation measures could contribute and the nexus could contribute to this global goal that is also on the table for at the Climate Change Convention later this year. Finally, for the third question, from 2015 onwards, the Sustainable Development Goals will be in place. How can the nexus approach contribute to their achievement? And has the session discussed the SDGs in light of the nexus and vice versa? Well, sadly, the session presenters did not address the SDGs nor the questions and answers that were implemented in that session, since the session focused more on the ground practical issues of the nexus. But nevertheless, as Professor Bogárdi mentioned, there are 17 goals and hundreds of targets, and indeed, the Nexus approach can contribute to the achievement of these SDGs. I can refer, for example, to SDG 13, that contains the target of land degradation neutrality, or the targets on water that are embedded in several SDGs, or the target or the SDG on food security. So there are many opportunities for the SDGs to be implemented on the ground with a Nexus approach. However, I want to highlight the issue of the process of the SDGs. The SDGs, as we were discussing just minutes ago, are up there on the sky, for the smallholder farmer or the local community, the local government. So how can these global targets, goals and targets can be implemented, can be translated on the ground with effective policies and practices? Even though the SDGs will not be a legislative framework, they will be just an aspirational purpose for all of us, based on what happened in Rio +20 and what happened 20 years ago in Rio 1992. So this is the end result of a process that calls for the aspiration of achieving 17 goals. So this calls for a more integrative approach, not only at the research level, let's say at the level of the universities, but also at the level of the UN and other international institutions that at this moment are working still on silos, and still according to their own mandate. So how can this be broken into this silo approach can be broken and start reflecting and acting upon a more Nexus approach? I'm saying this because I work in the UNCCD convention. This convention has a mandate on land, a limited mandate on land, because we are addressing the issue of drylands. This is what the text of the convention says. But there is no other legal framework at the international level addressing the issue of land and soils. So the issue of water, 22 UN institutions. So how is it that we are going to address the issue of the Nexus, not only at the research level, which is universities, but also at the level of the international negotiation arena. And this is something important when we are considering the guidance to the implementation of the SDGs. Finally, I want to say about the SDGs and their linkage to the other important element of the international framework, which is the climate change conference this year, in which a new agreement will be adopted. We all of us expect that's going to happen. There is this issue of the 2 degrees target, and this is a target of 2 degrees increase in the temperature at the planetary level. So the Nexus here has also a role to play. We know that in the convention, we know that the soil organic carbon, 1% increase in soil organic carbon translate into 3% increase in water availability, more or less, according to science. So how is it that we are going to put these elements into the new treaty that's going to be adopted in Paris? There is one way, the national intended determined contributions, INDCs, which all countries have to produce. So these INDCs have to have a land, soil, and water and waste component into their what they are going to do within the next decades regarding climate change to achieve the 2 degrees target. And this is the message we have from session 1.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking up this challenge to answering these 3 questions. And also, I am very grateful that you mentioned 2 aspects. One, that the SDGs should be brought down to the human scale, where people can act. And this very strong message gives me also the chance to proceed to the second speaker of this panel, who will report on 2 sessions. One is the governance of climate adaptation, comparing experiences of diverse regions and sectors. And 2B, climate adaptation from the bottom-up perspective, stakeholder involvement, perspectives, and knowledge. The lead convener is Joanne Vinke-deKruijf from the University of Osnabrück. And if you just want to say a word on your background, and since you are the only lady of this panel and have to report on 2 topics, so the floor is yours, and we are very interested to see how can we bring it to the proper level to make it happen.
Thank you very much. So I'm working at the University of Osnabrück at the Institute of Environmental Systems Research. These 2 sessions I convened with 2 former colleagues of the University of Twente, Gül Özerol and Cheryl de Boer. Well, I will not introduce myself much further. Let's just talk about the sessions and the results. We had 8 very interesting presentations, and they were all focused on the human factor in climate change adaptation. And we were so lucky to have cases from all around the world. So some were just single case studies, some were comparative research, but all very high quality contributions, and also several brief poster presentations. So in these presentations, it became very clear that climate change adaptation is an challenge that involves many different actors. So some presenters were focusing really on the individuals, for example, farmers. Others were approaching climate change adaptation from the perspective of river basin organizations. Then there were think tanks, water authorities, networks, but also the role of universities and researchers we discussed quite extensively. And then this was discussed at different levels. So also this multi-level governance aspect came back in various presentations, and what needs to be done at the regional level, what needs to be done really at the local level, at the household level even. Also, we addressed many different aspects of climate change, so that it has impacts on drought, on flooding, on groundwater, irrigation, ecosystem services, but also on, things that are outside the natural resources management system, for example, on migration and state security in the end. So that everything is kind of connected to everything, and that this human dimension is very important. Various presenters were presenting some kind of governance assessment, so they all had different definitions of governance and different way of assessing governance, but it was very interesting to see. And one of the things that came out of this as well is that one of the questions that was addressed is whether we can just do business as usual, or whether we should really do something different, or that climate change adaptation is really not really something new, because we are already adapting all the time. And we also saw examples of institutions that are already work in a very integrated way, and that adaptation for these kind of institutions or organizations is something very natural. Also, we saw interesting examples of traditional approaches and traditional ecological knowledge that does no longer apply, so that there is some kind of transformation needed. As for climate change in general and adapting to climate change, various presenters showed that when it comes to planning, in many countries there are things underway. So in policies you see that climate change adaptation is increasingly acknowledged. However, to also do it in practice is another story, to implement it, to enforce it. And then, of course, there is great differences across regions. The awareness of climate change and also what they are actually doing about climate change. And also, obviously, some parts of the world are much more vulnerable to climate change than others, so there is much more urgency to really do something about climate change. So this is what I wanted to report back on climate change, or rather maybe the governance of climate change. Well, we also have been discussing the Nexus. Well, in that sense, well, maybe not the Nexus as such, but we intensively discussed the need for cross-sectoral integration. One person also asked, what does it actually mean, the Nexus, and is it really something new, and what does it really add? So I think we took quite a critical approach towards whether the Nexus is relevant or not. And interesting was also that in the afternoon session we discussed like how is the Nexus really playing a role, maybe also in your research, and people said, okay, well, that there are interlinkages across sectors. Well, that is so obvious, especially when you come from a more problem-based perspective and from the local level, so that things are interlinked, and also the importance of networks and yeah, that different sectors are involved and also different levels. That was very clear to everyone. But the nexus itself was more seen as a scientific concept or a policy concept than really something that is relevant to people or organizations, maybe lower level organizations, let's put it like that. So it was more seen as a higher level concept, a scientific concept in our session. Then we also discussed briefly the Sustainable Development Goals, and interesting, that was also really, well, as the previous speaker also said, it's also a bit seen as some higher level concept, and there's a big challenge of translating, and probably what we will see, there will be multiple translations. So first from global level kind of to the national level, and then of course, yeah, how does it ever get to the local level? And that is of course, again, the question if that is necessary, but there needs to be some kind of alignment in the end to what is happening really at the local level. We see several challenges when, or we could identify several challenges when in relation to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. One is that to implement Sustainable Development Goals, society needs to transform, of course, and governance assessments can help to understand these transformations, but there is really a need to combine it also with what are the real impacts on the biophysical context. So if we want to understand the governance of climate change adaptation, we need to understand both sides. So we need to understand governance systems, but we also need to understand what kind of governance system really works, in which context. So we really need to integrate also maybe knowledge from different disciplines. But then to really understand what are the impacts of certain strategies or certain approaches or certain governance systems on the floor, that is a time issue. And it takes a long time to really assess. So this is often very difficult for researchers. And the time issue was mentioned several times, because then there was another challenge, especially for researchers. That is to actually do their research. To do research, you need to trust from people with whom you collaborate with, because you can only, especially when you do governance assessment or when you work with local people, it requires that you have context at these local levels, good translators, knowledge brokers, networks, trust. This again requires time. And well, one observation that was made is that we can't achieve the development of trust and networks and doing good fieldwork, making good assessments when we have only a short period of time to do our research, because funding is often just giving for a short period of time, like 3 years periods. PhDs work 3 years on the topics. So that was really a call for funders of research to think about this. Another aspect that I would like to raise that came very clearly out of the afternoon session also is the need for communication, training and education. But so in various presentations, they clearly showed that this is beneficial also to raise awareness of certain aspects and to make people change their behavior. Of course, it's not as strong as when people have a concrete experience in a disaster, but that communication and especially also education can play an important role, but only when adapted to local needs. That means local culture, avoiding jargon and those kind of things. And it also asks a different attitude from scientists. I have to say we were in a quite scientific session with a lot of researchers, so that's I guess my reporting back is also a bit a scientific report. But that a scientist should not just be a researcher, but also be a research object. You need to be a teacher, but at the same time be a student, so that you should be very open to this. So I think an important, we started this session with that we wanted to find out what works in which context and why. That's also the reason for having all these comparisons included. And I think it became very clear that there's really very important to adapt to local needs, and that we see certain trends that can be identified all over the world maybe, but in the end it all comes back to the local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to bring the human component. And you are getting a well-deserved applause. Actually, you should have given also a well-deserved applause for Sergio. Okay, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Okay, I really appreciate your hint that Nexus and SDGs are seen by many as still very much up in the sky, or concepts which have to translate into day-to-day realities and action plans. And I see a number of good Nexus-related conference teams for the future. So Reza, please make notes that what type of good Dresden Nexus conference teams can emerge here. I also very much appreciate and agree that you mentioned two T's, trust and time, and they are very, very interlinked. If you do not have time, you cannot build trust. If you don't have trust, nothing will happen. And this is essential. Of course, you mentioned also the most difficult, society, of course, have to change. This is a very difficult thing to do, but definitely it indicates that both the day-to-day actors, but also the different levels and organizations of governance and management have to redesign or rethink their role, especially if SDGs, the interlinkages, and the Nexus is to become reality. Thank you very much. And when we talk about Nexus and talk about climate change, then, of course, the next theme, what information on climate change do we need to manage the resources of water, soil, and waste? The Dresden Nexus is very essential. So I invite Professor Christian Bernhofer, the lead convener of this session, to report back. Professor Bernhofer is professor for meteorology of the Technical University of Dresden, so he is at home, and he is a long-time collaborator of UNU-FLORES. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm really feeling home, to some degree a little strange too, in front of this big audience, sitting on a chair. So I hope I'm not going to be grilled, and I hope that we will all enjoy this session. I want to report on session number 3, and I also want to raise again the question that had been already mentioned by János Bogárdi. The session asked for contributions on the proper climate information, helping to manage water, soil, and waste, with the special emphasis on the Nexus. We had quite some comprehensive and diverse presentation from different countries around the world. And this started with one on land use and climate change in Kenya. And the interesting thing was whether weather or climate, or on the other hand, management is more important. And obviously, the question was not completely answered. However, my personal impression was that management is more important, which is eventually often observed. Then we had one presentation by the co-convener from IAG, and he used economic indicators as proxies for other important measures of both the Nexus as well as climate change. And this was very interesting in terms of that we are not always linked and fixed to standard climate data. There are other climate data information available, especially for the past. Then there was one presentation on reservoir management in Brazil, which was using statistical downscaling tools for hydrological impact assessment. Then we shifted to one from the FAO that reported on a very interesting complete modeling chain based on climate modeling in the beginning and ending with the yield estimate based on the mosaic modeling chain. And the interesting news here was that it is to some degree open access, however you need some specific training to use it. So that's maybe a very good answer to the question of the Nexus conference. Then we had one presentation on integrated regional climate change that was also using quantitative data for an indicator, complex integrated indicators that helps to understand vulnerability at the example of Saxony. And finally, there was a presentation on the Global Land Project that made clear that there's this long history of IGBP the long history of the global water, global carbon, global land project that will lead to future Earth as a new integrated project. In my point of view, before I come to János' 3 questions, the session made very clear what the needs are in terms of data. We need to address climate change and the nexus. So first, we need regional scale or even local scale data with very high spatial and also temporal resolution, like half-hourly data, which are not available yet. So we have to find tools to downscale data, not both in the spatial but also in the temporal scale. And we need to do this also to access risks due to extremes. So we have to look at extremes, and we have also to look at climate variability, which is maybe even important to climate change. So the variability in some areas are maybe higher than the trends, and we have to address those existing variability. Then next point is treatment of uncertainties, which is very important. So we have to treat uncertainties, and we have also to help modelers that do impact and adaptation measure identification, that they don't have to use thousands of climate change output data, but that they have some help by communicating the necessary reduction of those data. And this is including, maybe it's also helpful to think that it eventually helps to decrease uncertainty by having management options, and as many options you can preserve for the future, the better it is for a future adaptation. And if this is no regret, then it's easy, but even if it's just a good chance for helping in the future, it will actually be a good idea to have this additional reduction through keeping options available. Finally, for additional data sources, there are additional data sources from the very traditional data that had been also mentioned in the very first presentation today, which is station data. Station data will remain always the backbone of climate information, but additionally remote sensing is available, and we should utilize as much as possible without doing too fast and extreme change to the station network, because this is the one we can really rely on also regarding data from the past. What I would also like to mention is that model output data become more and more important as an additional data source, and this is not only for climate change, it's also maybe for model output that helps us to understand the present as well. So to, for example, reduce the available resolution in space and time. And now to János' questions. The first, how important is climate change? As had been mentioned already, I think climate change is just one, but maybe sometimes a decisive additional threat to ecosystems, additional threat to human endorsements, etc. So, but we have to take it into account maybe additionally, and it will increase. It's the trend. And at the moment, maybe the variability is higher than the trend, but in the future, that trend will overcome the variability. So we have to face climate change. There is quantitative assessment, but very often I have the feeling that some of the studies remained on the qualitative level. That's not bad, but it's only the first step. So you should really try to be quantitative. What is most sensitive was another question. Obviously, there is a clear relationship between water and soil, and this is very often addressed, and I think that water and soil from the Nexus that's addressed at UNU-FLORES is the most clear linkage. Waste is maybe more complicated, but it has to be seen as part of a chain where also some increments of waste, some essential parts of waste might be used for nutrient recycling, for example, in agriculture, but it's only indirectly dependent on climate change. The next was the adaptation measures. My point of view, this points toward keeping options available. We do not know exactly what will come. I don't actually think that the 2-degree target will be very feasible. At the moment, it doesn't look like it's feasible, so we have to face maybe more than 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees globally, with some areas that face even stronger increments, specifically in the Arctic. But all this points towards not deciding too early to skip an option, but to think on potential adaptations in the future. This is, for example, if you look at an urban environment, it's good to have the space to plant trees, even if you don't plant trees, because they might shade you in the future. And if you don't leave the space to plant them, then it's not possible to plant them in the future. So that's like keeping options available. And with the SDGs, I always like to say I'm not a politician, but I would like to keep Earth preserved, and therefore the Nexus is maybe one of the important things we have to keep in mind, because only integral thinking will help us to understand the way resources can be preserved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your messages, also identifying water, soil as probably the most vulnerable. We, coming from the water profession, we of course believe water is the most important, but as a moving component which is linking the terrestrial and the atmospheric system, it's definitely, if something happens with a hydrological cycle, then the other two components could suffer as well. I also liked very much that you mentioned that 2 degrees might not be feasible to keep. This is a kind of statement which usually only an independent scientist can make, because policy-wise it is a kind of sacred cow, and we are not supposed to slaughter sacred cows easily. But it is important that if something does not look like feasible, that is spelled out, and we think beyond limits which we definitely do not want to surpass, but realities are around, and to ignore them would be as dangerous as just closing our eyes. Thank you very much. When we talked about water, food security, then you automatically focus on rural environment. And many of the presentations I witnessed today were rather land use, animal husbandry, water, forests, etc. But human wealth is predominantly created in industries. And therefore, it is also very important that we are not only looking to the rural area when we talk about the Nexus challenges, but also, and climate change challenges, but also to the industries. Session number 4 was on inclusive and sustainable industrial development for resources-efficient industries. And my colleague, Igor Volodin, from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, will report what this session contributed to the challenging questions and how the session proceeded. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Bogárdi. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me introduce myself. My name is Igor Volodin. I'm the deputy to the director of the environmental management branch, and this belongs to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which is UNIDO, with the headquarters in Vienna. So we'll bring you the industry perspective towards the Nexus and issues of the Nexus and the SDGs and a number of other issues. We had this morning 3 very different presentations. One is on the industrial resource efficiency at the global level, including water and waste, with the examples of pilot projects at the enterprise level. And also that was highlighting the importance of the industry as the main driver for job creation and poverty reduction. Indeed, it was noted that the economic growth in the world is highly desirable in many, many parts of the world. We know that from the session that nearly 2 billion people live with the income of like around $1 a day. Therefore, the economic growth is seen as the driver for the poverty alleviation. And industry development is perceived as one of the major drivers for the economic development. So it's now coming back very rapidly to the scene. We had very rich discussions. Industry accounts for approximately 30% of the greenhouse gases and about 20% of the water. And as I was already saying, most of the countries would like to have the economic growth or continue to have the economic growth. However, we are at the limits of our resources in many instances. And what would be the main challenge at the same time as a solution, as it was seen from the session, is that we should decouple the economic growth from the resource consumption. There was a lot of statistics given in that sense. So it's about the part of that is just to answer some of the questions if we have the quantitative data on a number of things. Yes, we do have some. And of course, the data related to the economic growth versus the resource consumption. So it was very clearly seen that the countries with the highest GDP level actually have the highest resource consumption levels as well. But this cannot be continued because everyone wants to have economic growth. And at the same time, it was showing that the statistics from the International Resource Panel that most of the continents are above the limits with the resource consumptions, well above the limits with the resource consumption. There is only one continent which is below, which is Africa. But ironically, this is also the continent with the highest level of poverty. And the need for the economic growth there is highly desirable. Therefore, it has to be somehow accounted that we should have strategies and patterns of how can we decouple the economic growth from the resource consumption. What was discussed that we might have certain new business models, and there was a long discussion on the consumption patterns. Indeed, if you take certain things, what we need, like there was an example of a cellular phone, what we need, or car sharing, in that sense, what we really need is a function of the phone. We don't have to have the hardware by itself. What we want to talk, we want to use the internet, we want to use multimedia, but not necessarily we want to have. So the proposal was one of the possible interesting solutions was that there could be kind of a leasing organized. And if the producer knows that it has to take back a cell phone or whatever product, that will be an entirely different the design and production pattern. So that was very interesting from my point of view. Another discussion was about the cost of the product, and that was what was noted, that the resource accounts for approximately across the board 40% of the cost of the product, whereas the labor is for 20%. And indeed, there's been quite a bit of work with the reduction on the labor cost and the cost of the production, and that it has brought it to 20%. So there was a issue, a question raised, isn't that time now to look into the resource efficiency, which accounts for 40%, and not to squeeze more the labor cost? And there was another very interesting example of the e-waste in Ghana, And it was shown that there is a very, very high negative impact on the informally waste recycling on soils and the local level. And a high level of contamination is directly threatening water and food security in that particular region. And also the most important is the health of the population. And this is the illegal traffic because the e-waste is imported to Ghana as a second-hand, I don't know, computer, refrigerator, whatever it is. But in fact, 80% is an entire scrap, maybe 10% or 20% operates, but it is all cleared in the customs like, you know, second-hand operational products. And this has to be stopped. This unsustainable cheating has to be stopped. So the strengthening of the policies to prevent the exports of the waste from one country to another is very, very essential to reducing the flux of e-waste to developing countries. We had also a very interesting case from this region, Dresden, and the surroundings, and about the climate change considerations for the small and medium-scale industries. And that was quite interesting to note that the industries, SMEs and medium-scale industries right here in Dresden are not particularly perceiving the climate change as a challenge for them. So they might, if you give more information, and many of them actually have very little corporate planning or none. So in that sense, it's very difficult. But what was the solution proposed? And there is a very successful project from the Technical University of Dresden, is that sensibilizing the industries and using an integrated approach to incorporate the climate change adaptation into the overall management models, management strategies. So, and what was also interesting, because there was a question from the floor, whether it could be replicated. And because it definitely can be replicated in Europe, so for us, because our major clients are the developing countries and the countries with economies in transition. So the answer was, yes, that can be done using the same approaches and the same methodologies with the same clusters of industries. So if we couple the industries from these regions with the developing countries, the same clusters, so that might be a successful model for the future to incorporate for the SMEs, which are, you know, extremely difficult to influence in developing countries. Now I'm coming to the questions, if you allow me. So the climate change has a significant impact in the various components. What kind of a conclusion from the session we can draw on which component of the nexus is more reliable? What was clear message from the session that there should be no emphasis on one particular element of the resource. Each of them are very important, and from the point of view of the industry and perspective of the industry, it's a resource efficiency as a holistic approach which should really do, and that would be the most natural also for the industry. Yes, we had a high emphasis on the energy when the energy costs were high, and that gave some impact. We had also on the water. But for the industry, it's easier. I mean, the cost would be similar, if not the same, to look into overall resource efficiency. So the nexus could be broadened. That would include definitely the climate change, water and energy, but it can also incorporate all other resources, very, very important resources, and that we could try and decouple the economic growth with the resource consumption. How can we use to provide the basis for adaptation? So I think I was already, actually, I answered that question from the Dresden just a minute ago. And SDGs and the discussion. That was a clear feeling from actually two parts of the session that industry is not particularly involved into the discussions on the SDGs. It's you know, some larger 2 or 3 multinationals are there, but in general it's a UN exercise, where primarily UN exercise, and industry greatly is not involved. Again, this was the feeling from the session. So, however, at the same time, industry can really be very, very helpful by decoupling the economic growth and promote the sustainable economic development and using the holistic approach. So if we have now, and that's why I'm very happy to report to you that the SDG number 9 has the inclusive and sustainable industrial development, innovation, and infrastructure building, and coupled with the energy SDG and water SDG, I think we could work together very well into bringing this to the better levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Volodin, for this very interesting account. The core message I would take home for myself is make more with less for the resource efficiency. Also, if I take all the elements of your report together, I would, looking into the future, would say we are at the dawn of a new industrial revolution. Do more with less. This interesting leasing model, take back your own waste and recycle it. It is really a challenging age. And when you mentioned that industries are not yet, or they do not feel yet part of the SDGs, it is also a kind of mandate for us to change it, to bring them in, because as you mentioned, much can be achieved. You mentioned also one more point among the resources, energy. And this is, for me, the lead word to come to the 5th and last session, which will be reported here, the sustainable energy solutions under conditions of climate change. This will be reported by Richard Taylor, who is Executive Director of the International Hydropower Association. This IHA is probably the youngest of the water professional associations, but youngest does not mean it's a child. It is, I believe, almost 20 years experience and very strong presence in all the water debates, which gives me the hope to see the water energy nexus highlighted by your session. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Bogárdi. Coming to the end of a long chain of reporting back, I feel that I should be brief to spare you the repetition that I think some of our sessions were identifying. And I'll try and answer the questions, the 3 questions, through my reporting back of our discussions. And I should also acknowledge the co-conveners for this work on the session on sustainable energy solutions under climate change conditions, the Vietnam Center for Technology Responding to Climate Change, and our own UNU-FLORES for the support and bringing together this session, which I think was diverse and constructive. We looked, first of all, through the lens of soil, water and waste at the challenge of delivering sustainability through energy systems, and more broadly through the water, energy and food nexus. We had presentations on renewable systems, one mature renewable energy system, which was the case of Iceland,
and one developing system in the case of Ethiopia. We also looked at the case of climate change and the relationship with hydropower and also with bioenergy. But in all of the renewable energy technologies were discussed to some extent. First of all, from the renewable energy systems point of view, the case of Iceland is quite interesting. First of all, it reminded us of the fact that, first of all, when you take a systems approach, renewable energies can provide reliable, secure, and comprehensive energy services, not just in power, but also heat and transport. And I think these things are very quickly lost in the policy debates, where you need to think about all of the services that we use energy for and the interrelationships that we have between sectors. Another interesting aspect from Iceland was the need to continue to develop and how to become more efficient and deliver more services in a sustainable way. And there was an increasing interrelationship between the technologies, the reliance on providing different types of energy, the characteristics of the different technologies, evidence that there is no one technology as a panacea. It is a system and it is a symphony. If you think of a musical analogy, you need all the instruments to make the music. In the case of Ethiopia, there is a growing need to diversify, broaden the technologies and increase the level of deployment of energy. And the need to take climate change into consideration in the choices that are in front of that important country. The two things that linked those case studies was the need to interconnect, and not just a local view, extremely important, what resources are available to the country and to the specific areas of the country, but also the need to interconnect with neighbouring countries and how important this interconnection is in terms of mitigating and sharing risks, and how when you are more broadly connected, we can get more reliable systems and deal with some of the challenges of the vulnerabilities that are inherent in some of the energy that is abundant but not necessarily always predictable. We moved then on to the case of hydropower and looked at hydropower through the lens of climate change from 4 particular perspectives. For all energy, hydropower was the case, but is true for all energy technologies. We need to think about, first of all, what is the impact on climate change that particular activity has. All energy has some environmental and climate impact from its activities, and you have to know your own footprint before you can discuss offsetting heavier footprints from other technologies. We also need to look at vulnerability to climate change and how that will affect operations, security, and to be able to predict and make plans into the long term about what is the right energy mix of the future, taking into consideration all the other demands, change, and conditions that might be variable, and then superimposing the challenge of climate change. Thirdly, looking at the mitigating role. What, if you're making a choice solely on offsetting greenhouse gas, would be your energy mix, or what other things do you need to take into consideration when you're thinking and planning in terms of energy and its interrelationship with other sectors? And lastly, adaptation. How are you going to make an energy system that is climate-proofed enough to be resilient to the changes that might bring about? Going back to our first case study, the region that was under study is actually getting wetter. We always use as a proxy for climate change a picture of desiccated soil. Many, many parts of the world are going to get wetter. They're going to have more extreme events. They're going to have flooding to manage. How do we make our infrastructure, our energy systems resilient to these challenges, both from the point of view of drought mitigation, but also flood reduction as well? From the point of view of bioenergy, we looked at the relationship and indeed the carbon competition, as it was described, at the production of biomass and also the maintenance of soil organic matter, and how this could be predicted and this feed into management decision making about resource deployment. And then lastly, we looked at the role and interrelationship with agriculture and how dependent agriculture is, for example, on energy price, but also how decisions, we talk about becoming more productive. We talk about more crops, more output, more production per unit of land. But what is the ramification on other sectors, such as the energy sector, the need for more fertilizer, the consequence of more energy for that fertilizer, and the cost and impacts that that might bring? So in terms of recommendations, we did discuss to some extent the need to identify risks and responsibilities, and the sharing of those risks and responsibilities, and the important role of government, because it's impossible to make large-scale decisions and long-term planning without an engaged and leadership from the government perspective. We also recognise that many tools exist that are useful, that they are building on knowledge, and there's a great deal of knowledge that is there. Going back to our first case study, there is now integration of the knowledge about potential climate change going into decision making, making decisions on investments, making decisions on markets, and looking at making sure that the services that are desperately needed will be provided for in the future. But these tools need to be perhaps better integrated, and there are many tools that could be coupled and brought together in terms of taking into consideration other sectors than for which they were originally designed to serve. We also talked about subsidies and how these could, in some circumstances, lead to some perverse outcomes. In general, I would say most of our room was either on the side of avoid them altogether or use them with extreme care. We also talked about information and access to information, and how important this is, data accessibility will be to improving our means to make more informed decisions in the future. And lastly, to take a sustainability approach and to involve as many stakeholders as possible in long-term strategic planning and make sure that we factor in climate resilience into every decision we make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For your account, you mentioned the word symphony, which means if you want to play a symphony well, you really have a very interconnected group of people who know where to stop playing the instrument when the next is starting. Interconnectedness is the name of the game. You also countered some of the stereotypes of climate change, and your warning that it's not only parched earth which will characterize climate change is reminding me that we are going to face many surprises and challenges ahead, for which we need, as you mentioned, leadership. And leadership is to lead, sometimes to convince people that some of the solutions may not be palatable for first. And this is my key word to invite now the two other members of the panel who will comment on today's proceedings from the perspective of member states. We have two member states representatives, as I have introduced them at the onset of this session, and I had the difficult choice to say whom should I invite first. As a water resources engineer, I decided the hydrological principle. As water flows downhill, we start upstream. And this is my pleasure to invite Dr. Ashenafi from Ethiopia to be the first speaker, followed then by His Excellency Higazy from Egypt. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me introduce myself. I am Abraha from Ethiopia, representing the Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy, and Tigray Regional Water Bureau. I am responsible for the irrigation department in Tigray regional state. I'm here to participate on the workshop, and also we had an agreement, or we work together with the United National University, FLORES. We made an agreement to work together on the drought risk management mechanisms. Then we already started to do on the drought management measures. Then we also participate also on today's presentation. I participated some of the presentation here and on the climate changes. As we see, to manage our environmental resources, we need to work on poverty environment management system. Then, as you know, my country are suffering for drought, for frequent droughts for so many years. It is due to poor management for environment. It's not due to the resource. We have a lot of resources, but the problem is only how to manage those resources. So we are working on poverty and environmental resources. And we are also working on how to manage these resources by combining the biophysical systems and institutions. And we are working, applying Nexus systems. That is, we need to manage water and energy. That is hydropower. We are working a lot on hydropower development. And we are also working on water and food, mainly for irrigations. And we are also working for those managing institutions. Coming to today's presentation, the climate change, as you know, the consequence of this climate change is drought or flood. We don't have any flooding problems in Ethiopia, but we have a drought problem in Ethiopia. So to manage these drought problems, we have a policy that is climate resilient green economy. So we produce 4 pillars. Those of the pillars for our policy is one, instead of expanding agriculture, we are morely focused on productivity of agriculture and livestock. Because there are, in a year, there is a population growth. So in order to feed our peoples, we are working on improving the agricultural products, not expanding the agricultures. On the other hand, we are working also in the energy aspects, water and energy. That is, we are producing a lot of energies, hydropowers, including the Renaissance dams. We are building a lot of hydropowers. Those hydropowers are working for domestic purposes and for marketing. Then we are applying renewable energy. That is also the second pillar for climate resilient green economy. And the third one, also we are working on expanding and reconstructing of forests. Of course, for climate change, land use change is also aggravates the climate change. So to do that, we are working on the on reforestations. So the reforestation is mainly for economic and ecosystem aspects. That means we are planting those economic value forests like coffee plantation and the like. So in that, the farmers are benefited, or they are increasing their income. At the same time, we are also working on the carbon sequestrations. That is, we are increasing the carbon stocks. And the fourth one is, since we are using our trees, forests for fuel, and we are working on electricity. So we are developing or expanding the transportation system with electric system. So we have our policies, this climate resilient green economy. So we are accepting this climate change as an opportunity because we are using this climate change into sustainable developments, like expanding our economic agricultural products and expanding water and energy relations. So for today's presentation, I participated two presentations here, that is working on Ethiopia. But I have a comment on the two presentations that they are not applying our climate resilient green economy because we have already a new policy that is done in Ethiopia, but they are working on the other issues. So my comment is, on the other hand, we are working on the energy, but still for our climate change, we are accepting the climate change because there is rainfall pattern changes in Ethiopia, and there is the increase of temperature in Ethiopia, but using this, we are creating an opportunity, as I have tried in my talks. We are working on it. Of course, we are also, as a mitigation measures, we are also adopting water and energy, that is drought risk management system. So for that, we are working with the University of United Nations Universities on adaptation of climate change, that is as a mitigation measure for drought risk management. This is what we are working with United Nations University, and more focus on irrigation development. That is, we have a problem of poverty, so we are working on water and food. That is irrigation development. So we are working on more on irrigation, but still we are also focusing on the climate changes in the sense of drought risk management. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for outlining this difficult task to counter climate change. In the meantime, to have a climate resilient society and sustainable development, betterment of life and livelihood conditions for your country. You did not mention, but I am a big admirer of your country who created dozens of universities to have the manpower, the brain power to lead this development. Thank you very much. And now this gives me the chance to invite the last but not least participant of this panel, His Excellency Mr. Mohamed Abdelhamid Ibrahim Higazy, Ambassador of Egypt to Germany, to give a kind of review, his impressions on issues which are relevant for his country, and probably due to his high office and being in the interface of diplomacy, politics, policy, and knowledge, which is to drive all these activities, your account would be definitely very challenging for the audience, which are mainly scientists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bogárdi, Professor Reda, honorable guests, dignitaries on the dais. Allow me at the outset just to thank you to keep me in the midst of wonderful minds and scientists. And the question is what a diplomat is doing in the middle of such an important scientific gathering. Water has a lot of politics, and water diplomacy and conflict resolutions is based in our region in how would a country conduct its relations with its neighbors when we share one of or the only vital life resource of water, the Nile, with 10 other Iberian countries. So when I started my relation with this file, I did my PhD on the integrated development of the River Nile Basin. And for a long period of time, we've been negotiating among the Iberian countries to reach a common ground. We all in conformity in our region that Ethiopia has the right to develop, Sudan has the right to regulate its water, and Egypt has the right to gain its water that has built its civilization. So the Nile is so important for all of us. It's the tool for a country like Ethiopia to reach its maybe mid-standard level economy, and for Sudan to regulate its annual floods, and for Egypt to maintain its water-based development, agriculture, and so on. It wasn't an easy path, but we managed. Maybe the day before yesterday, the 3 leaders have signed a very important declaration of principle. This kind of water diplomacy was shared by many scientists in the 3 Eastern Nile Basin, but still in the wider Nile, where 10 countries are participating, we all of the same agreement that integrated planning of our shared water resources is so important. Nexus strategy comes here as also an important tool to develop further our river system. The Nile Basin is not only water, it's also land, and of course, the waste or the discharge system of the river is as important as the stemming of the river or the upper stream. So this way of looking in an holistic manner, I've heard the word integrated thinking, holistic approach, the Nexus integrated strategy all the day long. And I believe that as the integrated development or the Nexus approach open new challenges and open new chances as well. Climate change, what I have withdrawn from all the intervenants is that it is a reality. Although we in Africa have contributed little to this climate change, but we are the most vulnerable who pays a hefty price for this climate change. And I guess that the argument that has been repeated in almost all the interventions is that we need a holistic approach. It's a transboundary concept. I think the Nexus looks at the system, the river system and the ecosystem in an integrated manner where water, soil, and discharge or waste is integrated. And I guess this is the way forward. And climate change is a threat, maybe as it has been stated, its ramifications on us in Africa is very well known. I mean, in my statement that I will leave for you maybe to read on the site of the UNU-FLORES, I would say that it have impacted us heavily, and we need to use the new approaches. We need more data. The climate change itself is a relatively new phenomena. We need to research more. We need more patterns. We need more scenarios. And I understand that a lot of solution can be envisaged in water basin development. So as maybe 15 or 20 years back, I have believed in the integrated development of our shared river basin, the Nile, and day before yesterday, I saw that materialized between the three leaders of the Eastern Nile or the Blue Nile. I'm certain that we will come again back all together in the Nile Basin in a one common ground. The Nexus strategy, I think, as a holistic approach that sustain our development is very much appreciated, and I think it is the way forward. From a climatic point of view, we cannot deal with the phenomena on a national level. We have to go beyond that into a regional level, besides, of course, the international drive to confront the phenomena. Many solutions has been given. One can state a lot of those integrative strategy, institutional building, data collections. We in Egypt, since last century, we are very much active in writing the precipitation level indicators, and you may recall in 1967 we even launched the hydrometeorological survey, which gathered also data where now we share it with all our African riparian state on the Nile. So what I wanted to conclude with, that the day was so fruitful for a diplomat to enhance his knowledge of water diplomacy, of how science can help us overcome political hurdles, and how can the Nexus strategy be a tool to further enhance our regional cooperation and add to the trust that has been growing with the years between the riparian states in each river basin. I studied the Mekong, for example, and I saw how the Mekong have transformed the livelihood of the riparian states from countries that were in difference to countries that is integrated in a basin-wide planning. And I'm sure climate change is an opposing challenge can be confronted through those holistic approach. This is how a diplomat is using your science to improve his negotiating ability and to use your technical solutions to develop trust in their region, particularly in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this excellent account. And in a way, you answered some of the complaints other session conveners said, that Nexus did not trickle down yet to the level of people. Your account says that Nexus, the acknowledgement that we have common challenges, would need pragmatic solutions, that you cannot divorce your riparian neighbor, led, and I congratulate your country and the other two countries which signed this agreement, which is really forward-looking and showing that the type of conversation, the type of brainstorming, the type of ideas which are coming up either from the UN system or from some research minds are getting their way into how the world is doing business. Your message was definitely very positive at the end of this very long day. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a little bit of conflict, not much. We started a bit later, and as I promised that at this stage we open the floor for a dialogue between the panel and the audience. So it's about 10 minutes. This can be opened, and then after that I would invite Professor Mokhtar for the concluding talk of the day. So the floor is open. I believe the microphones are in the known positions. So if you want to ask a question or clarify if your convener did not account about the session as clearly as you wished, this is a chance to do. Please.
So my name is Prakash Rao from India. I want to know whether the nexus, what we are talking is, drives the policy, or the policy drives the nexus, or they drive each other.
Are they?
Does the nexus, what we are talking now, does it drive the policy, like His Excellency mentioned, that it helps to negotiate and solve the problems, or the policy that we have, the governments have, will have to drive the nexus, or they mutually drive each other?
I believe this is a question first and foremost we ask His Excellency Mr. Higazy to answer.
Yeah, I think it is a very important question. Are we talking about the same integrated basin approach that I have studied 20 years back in Australia, or it is truly a new approach? I think it's an improvement in the way we look at basin management. You cannot deal with the river unless you look at the ecosystem, unless you look at its water, its soil, its discharge system. I think the nexus in itself carries a lot of integrative abilities that can help us to develop the basin if we added the energy as well. As my colleague from Ethiopia talk about the hydrology and talk about renewable as well. We have embarked, maybe even in Sharm el-Sheikh, about 10 days back on a very important and ambitious renewable strategy where we have introduced feed-in tariff, and where we, by 2020, will cover 20% of our needs from renewable. And I think the nexus, to answer your question briefly, is very important. It's an important tool. It can impact climatic change, and it can overcome on a national and regional level the challenges that is faced. We have heard in the morning how the Mississippi down reaches, for example, being in sufferance for certain years, got subsidy from the government on the modern irrigation techniques, and by that they avail more water for themselves and to the upper reaches to consume more. So this is how the Nexus collective strategy or holistic approach can develop our resources in a sustainable manner. I think it is very important, very valid, and it is part of the new concept of integrated basin planning that has been, I think, the norm over the past few decades. Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, Brazil Pradhan, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and I have a small comment to make on the comment by Professor Bernhofer. And you are mentioning that we cannot achieve 2-degree target, and you are arguing that it's good for adaptation so that we can prepare for 4-degree or even higher. But in terms of mitigation, if we already accepting that we can't, the rise in temperature will be more than 2-degree and the 2-degree target cannot be made, then probably we are not doing anything for mitigation. So I think it's a bit hard to accept this sort of statement that we can't meet 2-degree target. Otherwise, we will not do much thing that can be done for mitigation. And I think this should be something focused that we need to be discussed in Paris, and that's also one of the SDGs targets. So I just want to hear this comments on this from the panel. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad that I can eventually repair the statement to some degree, because I was not talking about 3 or 4 degrees of increase in temperature in order to stop any efforts in mitigation. The only message was we do not know whether our efforts in mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions will effectively produce good ways of reduction, and therefore we have also to prepare for the worst, which is that the increase in temperature might be higher. If I might also add, I believe, and this is probably very easy to understand, that climate mitigation is a nexus effort of itself, because it will always protect resources, which helps to make the increase in temperature, the change in precipitation regimes happen less quickly, and therefore the adaptation is also fostered, so we have advantages at this side as well, and maybe even our climate mitigation might even contribute to the protection of peace, because it reduces the risk of any kinds of fights for water or fight for carbon resources, for example. So I think that climate mitigation is a very important effort, and this has nothing to do with whether we should only look at the 2 degrees target.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much. That I was thinking that while these nice discussions, that there are a lot of gaps still to advance this Nexus approach globally. This is an international conference that I would like to raise this issue. I am very happy that the High Excellency Ambassador very much mentioned that we need more data. But I would like to stress here more that we need some knowledge-based development on resources and database development and networking of the database globally. And it already has started that ADB is working, World Bank is working. So I think that this issue also should be brought into the recommendation so that this database can be developed to advance this Nexus approach and the networking of the database at the regional level, global level, as well as the national level. That already has started. You can know that Asian Development Bank, they have developed knowledge-based network. And also the Japan Water Forum, that they are also working on that, especially in Asia. This conference is attending by the developed countries, also the developing countries. So this is also our concern, that how we developing countries can advance and can address this issue. Because I have seen that while addressing this water energy nexus in the Bangalore city, the data was very critical to find, and they don't keep the data in one place, as well as they don't segregate the data. There's how much energy they are using for water treatment, how much they're using for distribution, and this data wasn't segregated. I face a lot of problems to address this water energy nexus that I'll be speaking tomorrow on this water energy nexus in Bangalore city. And this is my research that I did in post-graduation in Queensland University. So thank you so much. I address this issue. I think you will bring it, address it, recommendation, so that that is some impact on the globally that conference has, so that national countries, that they can address this, that database development, and that will advance the research on the nexus approach, I think, furthermore. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I believe your emphasis on data and data sharing is very essential, because this is one element of trust building. If we share the data, it means we are disclosing the truth to each other and creating a basis upon which sustainable joint partnership solutions can emerge. So the gentleman who asked also the floor.
Thank you. It's a question really to the panel, but also to all of us to some extent. In this Nexus discussion, we're talking about everything being linked with everything, essentially. Yet we also often hear about decoupling, which is almost, if you like, a juxtaposition to the Nexus concept. Because we say, well, some things we have to decouple from each other. So we hear about decoupling social well-being and human well-being from economic growth, or going beyond economic growth. We talk about decoupling, just now I believe my colleague from UNIDO mentioned it, decoupling of economic growth from environmental impact. But sometimes I have the feeling that this is, well, I understand we have to change the relationships. We have to make sure economic growth contributes more to human well-being than it did in the past. I understand we have to make sure economic growth destroys less of the environment that it did in the past, but I'm not sure we can entirely separate these processes. I do believe that economic growth is a basis for well-being, and that whatever we do, whatever we produce, even seemingly immaterial goods, health, education, even those require us to extract resources from the ground and transform them and to provide something else. And it will have an impact on the environment. There's no healthcare without pharmaceutical industries. There's no education without computers, infrastructure. So is it about really decoupling, or is it about changing these relationships? I think this is more an overarching question for all of us.
Thank you very much. I'm looking to my fellow panelist who wants to comment on this comment or question.
Well, I don't know if I can really address this question completely, but just a few things that we also discussed in our session, because maybe also the point I made about the nexus was maybe not that clear. One of the points that was raised in our session is that, well, by definition, when you look at towards problems that we have in society, you can't see them in isolation. They are connected. So the point you make about that we should try maybe to decouple, I guess that is hardly possible. Things are connected anyway. And this is maybe something that is now increasingly acknowledged by having this nexus approach. But it's the concept of the nexus as such is not something that you would really find so much when you look at the local level or the regional level. Rather, they would just acknowledge that indeed things are interlinked. That we should be aware that even if people don't mention nexus, they could still acknowledge that things are interlinked, and that poses big challenges to governance to coordinate. And that is another thing that came out of our session, is this need for leadership and to have leadership across sectors who are able to bring different sectors together.
Thank you. Richard, please.
Yeah, I was thinking as you made that intervention that sometimes our discussion where everything is interconnected, everything has an impact on something else, it can become overwhelming. It can lead to some paralysis in decision making because there are so many unknowns. How do you then make an informed decision? So there is a need to, we all need boundaries. Certainly the people that fund our research need boundaries. And we need to specialize. We need to understand the components. But I think the message is that we then need to join those components up before we make actual decisions. But we have to understand the processes. And that very often needs to ring-fence particular issues, go into specific issues. An example in my world is the need, for example, to look at the water, energy, food nexus. Well, first of all, we need to look at those in couplets. I mean, what is the relationship between water and energy before you start thinking about water, energy and food and so on. So it's useful sometimes to draw those boundaries, to decouple all of the complexity, drill down, create specialized knowledge, but then incorporate that special knowledge in joined up decision making.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your contributions. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Just one addition to that, very short. In our session, we also had some doubts about how far we can decouple, how quickly. And I think the thinking was that if we get the incentives, and for the industry we can get some incentives to do certain things, if we demonstrate good best practices, then we can definitely do a lot of work towards the decoupling. But also the feeling was, at least from the audience of our section, that it might be a long road.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting at this stage the interaction, because we are running now 10 to 6.